is the Investor Connect podcast program. This is Hall T. Martin. I'm the host of the show, in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, private equity, family offices, and many other investor groups for startups and growth companies. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for joining us. Well, hello, this is Hall Martin with Investor Connect. Today we're here with Abe Kwon, partner at Lowenst Sandler, LLP. Lowenst Sandler is a national law firm with over 350 attorneys across offices in New York, Palo Alto, Roseland, New Jersey, Utah, and Washington, D.C. The firm is well known for its work with emerging companies, venture capital funds, and investors, providing strategic legal guidance across industries like technology, life sciences, fintech, and blockchain. Its culture emphasizes client service, innovation, and a strong commitment to community and pro bono work. Abe, thank you for joining us.
Hi, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So where are you calling from today?
I'm calling from my home office today, which is close to New York, although I don't live in New York itself, but I'm based out of our New York office and I'm there quite frequently.
So tell us more about your background before joining Lowenstein Sandler.
Yeah, of course. So I've been a startup venture capital lawyer for the better part of my 13, 14-year career. I joined Lowenstein last summer in 2024. And before that, I spent most of my career at Cooley, which is another well-known startup venture capital law firm, and then a little bit at Goodwin, and here I am now.
So great. So what are some of the key legal considerations for early stage fundraising, especially when it comes to venture capital, SPACs, and alternative capital vehicles?
Yeah, it's a good question. Advising high growth startups is, I feel like, kind of like being a legal Sherpa on a trek up to Mount Everest. There's a lot of excitement, few avalanches, of course, the occasional need for oxygen, or at least strong coffee, so to speak. And as part of that process that founders go through, there's definitely a lot of legal considerations that founders should be wise to not ignore. You know, when you're just getting started as a founder, especially if you're a first time founder, you absolutely want to make sure, you get the basic blocking and tackling stuff down, like make sure your company's incorporated the right way, make sure equity to you and your co-founders are handled, make sure you have vesting schedules, making sure all the IP is properly signed. But that's like sort of the easy basic stuff when you're getting started. And as your company hopefully continues to grow and, progress down the alphabet soup of financing rounds, whether it's Series C, Series A, Series B, and now I feel like there's more and more variations of those each day. Your legal needs undoubtedly will increase and change, and that's why I do think, hopefully this doesn't come off too self-serving. It is important to make sure you have trusted legal counsel in your corner that can help you not only address those concerns as they come up, but honestly, like, look around the corners, like help address and preempt the legal concerns before they even become concerns.
Well, great. Well, as companies grow, what best practices do you recommend for governance and board structuring? What's your advice there?
It's a good question. I get this question a lot. For the reality is, and I'll break it down maybe in three different steps. Like when you're just getting started and you're a brand new company, your board is going to probably be just you as the founder, and maybe some of your co-founders will join on as well. And, you want to be careful and thoughtful of who you put on your board when you're a very early stage company. I will say, and I work with a lot of early stage companies that often get requests from angel investors that want to be on the board. I probably usually recommend against that, especially if you want to go down the VC path, and I'll kind of get into why. But initially, when you're getting started, it's usually just the founders, and there's also a question of like, should I make every founder a director? And there's definitely pros and cons of that, and so you should definitely trust and talk to your trusted legal counsel. But it's pretty small early on, but as your company eventually grows and, hopefully, and assuming this is a path, and I don't want to say this as if like everyone needs to go down the venture capital path, but if you're a high growth startup and you go down that path, your investors usually want board seats. And it wouldn't be unusual for your Series C investor to take a board seat, your Series A investor take a board seat, your Series B investor take a board seat. And if you've done the math, you realized, after a few funding rounds, there's a lot of different directors. And each time your board composition almost gets renegotiated and recalibrated, which is why I do worry about really early stage companies putting too many people on the board, whether it's too many co-founders or too many advisors or angel investors, because the more investors you have, or sorry, the more directors you have later on when that gets reconstituted, people's feelings can kind of get hurt when you have that conversation and say, hey, you need to cycle off the board now, and then they might not take that kindly. So I'd probably recommend keeping it small, nimble early on, but make sure you have the right governance structure in place. And as your company grows, you got to maintain some flexibility, because each additional fundraising round, your board composition is likely going to change. At a minimum, you'll be adding more investor directors, and at some point, you'll also be adding independent directors as well. And certainly by the time you're a mature company, you do absolutely want to think about what the right structure for your board is. And, Delaware law, assuming your company's incorporated in Delaware, has certain requirements for fiduciary duty for your board members. That's something that you and each of your board members should be aware about and know about. And once again, hopefully I don't sound like a broken record, but legal counsel can help think through those kind of considerations. But you'll likely want to make sure you have a good mix of management and investors and independent directors, so that the board itself is doing its job and making sure they're running the company to the best of their ability in accordance with their fiduciary responsibilities.
Well, great. And so, how does your practice support cross-border investments and help startups expand globally? What do you guys do there?
It's a good question. I'm seeing, cross-border investments and, startups looking at things globally more so than ever. We work with a lot of US companies that are either looking to expand their operations abroad or taking investments from non-US investors. And we also see the flip side, like a lot of non-US based companies looking to either expand into the US or, go after the US capital markets. And so, our firm, while we are a US based firm, we work on a lot of those type of cross-border transactions and cross-border considerations. And it usually involves working hand in hand in tandem with other law firms in other jurisdictions, and making sure that together our clients, our companies that we're working with, are getting a holistic set of synchronized and harmonized advice to ensure that you're handling all the cross-border considerations sort of the right way. But I'm seeing this. I'd be curious to know, Paul, if you're seeing this more in your world, but more so than ever, I feel like non-US companies are looking to access American venture capital markets. And so we see many companies, and I'm working with a handful now, that their parent company is a Delaware corporation, but they otherwise don't have a US kind of operation at all. They're all based in Europe or Asia or anywhere else.
Yeah, it used to be just from Europe, but now I see a tremendous number of them coming from India. India, company, they got all the R&D there, but they want to set up shop in the US for the US market. And, language is not an issue for them, but time zone kind of is. So we're always looking to see if they have some presence in the US for raising funding from investors and closing
Yeah.
sales. Doing it abroad is a challenge.
100%, 100%. The one other thing I'll add here is, this isn't really a cross-border thing per se, but a lot of early stage founders I'm working with will often try to hire contractors or developers or even employees abroad. I think, everyone knows about some of these marketplaces like Fiverr or Upwork or whatnot. I'm not trying to pick on any one of them, just listing some of the examples that we see more often. I do want to urge the listeners to be really careful when they're doing that, because when you're engaging a non-US contractor or hiring a non-US employee, those individuals and their working relationship with your company are going to be governed by laws in that jurisdiction. And unless you happen to be a lawyer in India, for example, hiring someone in India could be really, really complicated. And so, once again, this is an absolute place where you don't want to mess that up. And you do want to talk to your lawyer to make sure you're dressing the right way. I mean, just to give you an example, I worked with a venture-backed company just last month that is a US based company, and most of their operations are here in the US, and most of the employees are based in the US, but they had one small contractor doing some, front end design work based in a, Central European country, which country it escapes me at the moment, but they were negotiating like a, pretty hefty Series Seed investment from a notable investor. And while I can't say the names of the companies, it's a well-known one. And one of the issues that came up on the precipice of closing was this independent contractor in mind, because of course the investor has an interest in ensuring all the IP of the company is properly owned by the company. They noted that this particular individual was in a country where some of the IP assignment laws were different, and we had to kind of pause the closing, make sure we engaged counsel in that country that knew how to operate in that country, and had to bring in a last minute new IP assignment agreement for bus and spenders. And thankfully, there wasn't really any issue. We were able to resolve it pretty quickly, but that's just an example of, why you certainly want to be careful here.
So we see a resurgence in crypto and digital securities today with the new administration. What's your perspective on the evolving legal requirements for emerging asset classes such as crypto and digital securities?
It's like hard to follow because it's changing so much. I mean, I know you know this, but back in like 2016, 2017, I truly felt like it was like Wild Wild West, where nobody quite knew what the landscape was going to look like from a legal perspective. And a lot of people, non-lawyers and maybe even some lawyers alike, were kind of just making up things and taking positions that later on had some, pretty impactful legal repercussions. And I feel like, with the recent administration's, take on this, and there's been some recent legislation on this, it- you know, I won't comment on whether I think the legislation is good or not, but I will say I think it's helpful to have a lot more guidance and less ambiguity on how these type of assets are going to be, regulated or not regulated or whatever it is. And I think that type of certainty is probably a good thing for the crypto and digital security industries. So yeah, that's my personal 2 cents.
You're right. Back in 2015, it was so many scams and rug pulls and the like that most of my investors stayed away. But today they're getting back, in particular family offices, they're starting to move into things like stable coins, the more the conservative side of things that seem to be pretty worked out as far as what the regulatory is going to be. I think there's still some concern about ownership and liquidity and those type of things down the way, but it's coming more and more.
I agree. Like I think the Genius Act passing has put a spotlight on stable coins for sure. And there's even recent regulations that passed last week that might allow, 401k plans to hold crypto assets. Potentially, I haven't like dived into it, but that's what it seems to indicate. So there's a lot more clarity now, which I think is really cool. I mean, and this is very different from 2015, 2016, when every single early stage startup of mine was calling me saying, "Hey, we want to do an ICO," and I had to talk them out of it, and they would say like, "But such and such lawyer is doing it. Like, why can't you help me with this?" And in retrospect, I think those companies and founders are glad that I talked them off of that ICO ledge, but it sure was different times.
Absolutely. So moving on, how do you help founders navigate M&A and IPO preparation? And what are you seeing for other exit strategies out there?
Yeah, I feel like exits are like graduation day. They're exciting, maybe a little scary. There's always, a lot of stress at the last second, but we like helping founders get to that exit. For a lot of founders, that is the end goal starting from day one. And so, we want to make sure that exit, whatever it is as smooth as possible and as non-eventful as possible, which is never the case, but that's what we strive for. And I think like there's a lot we do to help founders navigate like not only M&A and IPO, but other exit strategies, but all of it comes from day one. I think like my ideal like client attorney relationship is working with a founder from day one, helping them incorporate and growing with them through their Series C, Series A, Series B, Series C, and eventually like hopefully an IPO or exit. And if that's the case, like having that continuity and making sure I understand all the skeletons and the clause and the legal structure and the framework, like everything becomes so much easier from a diligence perspective and a framework perspective, because by that point, like I'm not just a higher hand just brought in to help with IPO or just brought in to help with M&A, but hopefully I will have become like trusted legal advisor that's been there with the founder from day one and helping to make sure we have best practices from a legal perspective covered from day one. And I think having that prophylactic legal setup almost is like, I mean, it's just like prophylactic medicine. It's like a billion times cheaper, way smoother, way easier. It's just better for everyone. And that's sort of the path that we help for. But, to get a little bit more into the weeds of it, I mean, we're thinking about the exit from day one. And so every single venture financing, for example, we as lawyers have the exit view in mind, whether that's an M&A, IPO, or something else. And in fact, when we're helping advise our clients on a particular term or provision in like a Series B term sheet, the founders may say, like, why does this provision matter? Like, I'm not doing an M&A event now, or I'm not doing an IPO next year. And a lot of those provisions do preview or contemplate what might happen, when there's an M&A event or what might happen when there's an IPO event, and helping to not only advise but fill in and inform our clients and our companies and founders on what that looks like. I think that's critical. And by the time we get to that exit event, whether it's an M&A or IPO readiness, like that all starts well before you get that term sheet or you engage that banker to start that process, because we want to make sure from a legal perspective all the ducks are in a row. Like the last thing you want to do is be in the middle of an M&A deal or IPO process and you realize there's a significant diligence issue from a legal risk perspective that holds everything up or leads to some other type of undesirable result. And it's hard to list all of those things out on the short podcast, but those are things that I think are super important and people should not ignore them. In terms of other extra strategies, I mean, there's a lot of them, Paul. I mean, you're probably seeing them too, but I feel like SPACs are now, back on the table after a couple of years of dormancy. And, I think I was talking to a colleague of mine that does a lot of those. And, right now there's like, I might be making this number up, but something like 60, 70 kind of active SPACs that are all like raising, and who knows how many of them will actually enter into meaningful de-SPAC transactions. But I feel like there's a lot of alternative ways to seek liquidity. I also think that like what I'll call like not quite aqua hires, but like venture M&A is very, very hot. Like obviously the capital markets, notwithstanding what I just said about de-SPACs and the occasional company going public, are pretty low. And I feel like a lot of founders are not going after liquidity that way. And so there's a lot of venture-backed companies that I think are being acquired, whether by private equity or other strategics or other venture-backed startups, and helping our founders navigate those type of exits, even if it's like even if it's not the billion-dollar exit that they're hoping for. Like there's been a lot of that, more so than ever in the last 12 months, and it's been really cool helping our founders navigate that.
Yeah, it's great to hear. So you have a lot of experience representing both entrepreneurs and VCs, and I'm sure some of those were challenging deals. What are some of the big lessons you learned from those?
It's a good question. Over my career, I've certainly worked with a whole host of different types of founders, personalities, VCs alike, and some of the more challenging deals often happens when there are down markets. Like in the last 2 years, I've worked on more down rounds and recaps than I ever have at any point in my career. And if you're doing the math, right now it's 2025, so I've been practicing for 12, 13 years. Like I was not practicing in the last global recession in 2008, 2009. I was still in law school then, so I didn't have the experience doing that. So when I first did a recap down round a couple of years ago, it was something that was newer to me. And unfortunately, over the last 2 years, I've done a lot of them now. And sometimes they're not easy, and no one really is happy, right? Like the current investors certainly aren't happy, the founders management aren't happy, but sometimes that's the only choice on the table to keep the company alive. And while they're challenging, those down rounds and recaps don't necessarily mean the company is doomed. I've seen plenty of companies come out of that all for the better and still lead to really good results for everyone. But the biggest lesson I've learned is, as a lawyer, learning how to work with the particular needs of any founder. And because not all founders are alike, not all startups are alike. Like some founders and startups, the right path is to go down that venture capital alphabet soup and go down the Series A, B, C, D, and then get acquired for a lot and go IPO and ring the bell on Nasdaq or whatever. And certainly, I think a lot of first time founders aspire and dream for that result. But the reality is that's not the only outcome, or that a lot of founders have, and that's okay. That's not a bad thing. Like some founders have a more circuitous path to get there, whether it's through recaps or down rounds. Sometimes founders leave their startup, or sometimes they get fired from their startup, and that doesn't necessarily spell doom on the startup either. And so, learning how to adapt my advice as primary outside counsel and as a lawyer to these companies, and adapting to the specific considerations for that particular company, it's been the biggest lesson I've learned, because no path is honestly the same, despite what the social media influences will say to early stage first time founders.
Yeah, it's good to hear. Well, so can you talk about your involvement in the national innovation ecosystems and the impact you've seen on local startup communities with that?
I'm based in New York, and it's really cool to see how 10 years ago the New York ecosystem for startups was not what it is now. It's really kind of grown tremendously. I think like the early part of my career, it was Silicon Valley or bust. And now I think, and maybe the pandemic helped with this, I'm not sure, but you certainly see other places that are great places to launch your startup, whether it's New York, whether it's Texas, or anywhere else. And I think it's really awesome to see how those ecosystems have grown and communities have really come together to build out kind of those communities in ways that I think would make, I don't know if it makes Silicon Valley jealous, but at least, they would come to appreciate that. Like you don't necessarily have to start your startup in Silicon Valley. It can be in Austin or Houston or New York or the Midwest. Like there's a lot of places to do that. And I think finding the local community is important because the way that ecosystem grows is, of course, not just the critical mass of founders and investors, but it's the whole like litany of people who are in that world, whether it's, startup bankers or startup lawyers and finding like exited founders who are great resources to serve as advisors. And of course, like especially post pandemic, I think like people are tuned to decentralized companies and connecting via Zoom more than ever. And we all get it. Like Zoom is not the best replacement for in person or in real life stuff, but it serves as I think a nice bridge for to allow founders and startups to reach success in geographies that they haven't been able to do. And I think that's a really cool thing. So it's been nice to see New York grow. And I, have companies and startups that are very successful in other ecosystems outside of New York and Bay Area, including Texas. And it's awesome to see how they're able to lean on their local community to help them grow and propel forward as well.
Great. So, what are the trends are you seeing in the ESG and impact investing space these days? And how are the legal frameworks adapting to sustainability-based capital?
I think this is like many things in the legal space. It is a little bit trend dependent. I felt like maybe 5 years ago, people were talking about ESG a lot more. In fact, there's an industry group called the National Venture Capital Association, or NVCA, that I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with. They put out a set of model documents to be used for price rounds, and they started even including model language for covenants related to some of these ESG things. So I think like starting from about 5 years ago ish, like there was a movement within the legal industry to hard code some of the more trends that people were seeing ESG were in the ESG spaces to incorporate them more into the daily fabric of these founders. And whether or not those are successful or not, I have no idea. I'm sure some academic has done some research on that. But what I'm starting to see and witness is it really does come down to the culture of any particular company and the founders of what they're trying to build. And some founders, I think, care a lot about different ESG, initiatives. Some founders, don't quite as much. And there are investors who care more so than others. And for some investors, those considerations are really important. They'll put that into the term sheet. They'll say, hey, we'll invest in you, but these are the different ESG considerations that are really important for us. And we're going to hard code those requirements into the contract. And it's about finding the right fit between those founders and investors because, I do work with some founders who, may not care as much about certain ESG considerations. And then when they see those type of provisions in term sheets, it sometimes rubs them the wrong way. On the other hand, some founders care about it a lot. And the last thing those founders want to do is get into bed with an investor who wants nothing to do with that. And so once again, finding that right fit that works with that particular company is of utmost importance in my mind.
That's great. And so, what's your advice for founders on choosing the right legal partner and preparing for due diligence?
Oh my goodness. Finding a lawyer is the age-old question. And of course, I'm going to sound self-serving on this one, but you got to find a good one. And like people always say, like, how do you find a good one? And I empathize. It's not easy. Like just to use an analogy, I know nothing about cars and I hate getting my car serviced for any type of service because I am so worried I'm going to get ripped off. Like, how do I find a good mechanic? How do I know what they're charging me is actually what I need? How do I know they're not inflating the prices? And the reality is, I have no idea of knowing because I just don't know anything about cars. And more importantly, I don't want to know anything about cars. It's just something that's not interesting to me. And so I think the way I solve that problem when I'm looking for a good car mechanic is word of mouth. Finding car mechanics that I know my trusted friends use and getting their feedback on why they picked a certain car mechanic is the most important thing. And in the same way, I would recommend to founders looking for your legal partner, like ask other successful founders what lawyer did you hire? Why did you hire them? What did you like about them? What did you not like about them? Because there's a billion considerations out there. You could go to a big firm, you could go to a small firm. And even within a big firm, there's many, many lawyers there. And the reality is, you could find any well-known law firm out there, and you're going to find people who love that firm, and you're going to find people who hate that firm because like that's just how things go. It's like a lawyer might provide great substantive technical legal advice, but the personality fit just might not jive with the client. And so finding that right fit is not an easy one, but I think it is made easier by finding people who you trust and getting their feedback. And I will say, don't be afraid to ask a lot of questions. You should try to get, two or three different recommendations of lawyers, and don't be afraid to interview them. Like, ask them, how many times have they done a venture financing? The last, I've worked with a lot of companies that used to, work with a lawyer that kind of wasn't the best legal partner from them from like a substantive technical perspective, because their primary practice was, I don't know, divorce law or immigration law. And they, happened to moonlight as a startup venture capital lawyer. And if the founder had just asked a simple question like, how many venture backed companies have you worked with in the last year? It would have been pretty apparent that this is not their like subject matter expertise. So don't be afraid to ask all those questions. Get recommendations from trusted advisors and friends and, investors, and, hopefully you can find the right fit.
Well, that's great advice. Well, in the last few minutes that we have here today, what else should we cover that we haven't?
I don't think anything else comes out to mind other than, I know the founder journey is a really hard path. I've worked with founders who have grinded at this for years, sometimes without success and sometimes with success. But I also think it's one of the most, at least from my vantage point, working alongside hundreds of founders over the last few years, one of the most rewarding things ever if you can kind of persevere through it and, you're able to overcome the litany of obstacles that I know many founders face.
That's great. Well, so how best for listeners get back in touch with you?
Sure. Feel free to DM me on LinkedIn, and you can include in the subject matter line Capital Connect, and I'll be sure to take a look at it. You can look me up on LinkedIn, Abe Kwon. I'm pretty sure I'm the only Abe Kwon, or one of very few Abe Kwons on LinkedIn, so hopefully it's not too hard. And I think the link will be in the show notes if I'm not mistaken, Hall. You can also email me, which is not too hard to find. If you Google me, you can find my firm bio, and my email address is listed there, but LinkedIn DMs are perfectly fine for me.
Great. Well, we'll put those contact details in the show notes. I want to thank you for joining us today, and we hope to have you back for a follow-up soon.
Appreciate it, Hall. Thank you.
Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org. Hall T. Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early-stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.